September 1570. The walled city of Nicosia, Cyprus. The air does not smell of the sea. It smells of iron, wet ash, and the distinct copper tang of industrialized death. For 45 days, the walls have held. Today, they are merely suggestions. The roar outside is not just an army. It is a geological event. The Ottoman war machine has arrived, and it does not knock. It grinds. Inside the convent of Saint Clare, the silence maintained for centuries through prayer and stone is about to be shattered by a noise so loud it will erase history. Sister Maria does not run. She kneels. The stone floor is cold against her knees, a sensation she uses to anchor herself to reality while the world above her dissolves. She hears the wood splinter. She hears the screams, not of soldiers, but of the city's infrastructure collapsing. What happens in the next 12 hours will be written out of polite history books. It will be whispered in Venetian courts and buried in Ottoman tax ledgers. It wasn't just a massacre. That would be too simple. That would be emotional. What happened next was one of history's most buried secrets, the bureaucratic processing of the sacred. This isn't pure myth. It comes from records buried in the Venetian state archives, supported by the letters of Pietro Valderio and the grim accounting of the Ottoman deformers. This story isn't about a battle. It is about what happens when a human being becomes an asset on a balance sheet. Hit like if you've ever wondered what happens to the people history wants to forget. To understand the fate of these women, you must first understand the entity that came for them. We often picture the Ottoman Empire as a horde of screaming warriors. This is a mistake. It is a comforting lie we tell ourselves to make them seem savage. The truth is far more terrifying. The Ottoman Empire was a machine, a complex, highly sophisticated, legalistic bureaucracy of conquest. When they breached Nicosia, they didn't just bring swords. They brought scribes. They brought accountants. They brought distinct protocols for the categorization of loot. And on that day, the nuns of Saint Clare were not viewed as women or even as enemies. They were viewed as high-value inventory. Zoom out. Look at the map. The year is 1570, but the mechanism has been refining itself for 200 years. From the fall of Constantinople to the shores of Otranto, the empire has perfected the art of the sack. This is not chaotic looting. It is a 3-day period of state-sanctioned transfer of property. The laws of war, codified by the scholars of the port, dictated exactly how a city taken by force was to be treated. If a city surrendered, it was spared. If it resisted, it was processed. Nicosia resisted. And so, the machine turned its gears. Imagine the terrifying efficiency of it. The soldiers are the teeth, but the infrastructure is the stomach. The goal is not to kill everyone. Dead people pay no taxes. Dead people cannot row galleys. Dead people cannot be sold in the markets of Istanbul to fund the next campaign. The goal is extraction. For the nuns, this system presented a horror that transcended physical pain. Their entire existence was defined by separation. They were the brides of Christ, walled off from the world, their bodies and souls dedicated to the spiritual. The Ottoman machine was designed to strip away that separation. It was an industrial thresher that harvested identity. When the doors of the convent burst open, it wasn't just men entering a female space. It was the profane entering the sacred, the market entering the temple. It was the collision of two absolute worlds, the spiritual absolute of Catholic Europe and the administrative absolute of the Ottoman expansion. We need to stop thinking of this as barbarism. Barbarism implies a lack of control. This was hyper-control. It was policy. The screaming you hear in the accounts of the time, that is the sound of the policy being implemented. The ganima, the spoils of war, included gold, silver, livestock, and humans. And in the eyes of the scribes, standing by the city gates with their inkpots and parchment, waiting to tally the intake, the women dragging their crosses were simply the most valuable livestock in the pen. Let us return to the micro. The sensation of the stone floor. Sister Maria knows the stories. News traveled fast in the Mediterranean, even for the cloistered. She knows of the sack of Otranto 80 years prior, where the archbishop was sawed in half. She knows of the fate of the women of Rhodes. The fear is not of death. In the theology of the 16th century, death is a doorway. Martyrdom is a crown. The fear is of survival. The fate worse than death is not a euphemism. It is a specific theological and social reality. To be taken meant to be enslaved. To be enslaved meant to be integrated into the harem system or the domestic service of a non-Christian master. For a nun, this was a spiritual annihilation. It was the forced breaking of vows that were meant to be eternal. It was to become a concubine, a servant, a thing used for pleasure or labor, stripped of the name given by God. As the boots thunder down the hallway, the nuns gather in the chapel. They do not have weapons. They have their habits, their rosaries, and their terror. The machine is at the door. The wood splinters. The light pours in harsh, blinding, foreign light. The separation is over. The processing begins. And the first step of the processing is the assessment of value. The soldiers who enter are not looking for a fight. They are looking for the young, the healthy, the beautiful. They are sorting diamonds from coal. Let's focus on the intermediary. The man who walks in first isn't a general. He is a janissary captain, perhaps Serbian or Greek by birth, taken himself as a boy through the devshirm system. He understands the value of human cargo because he was human cargo. He looks at the women huddled by the altar. He doesn't see holiness. He sees the market price in Istanbul. A young, educated woman, potentially noble, untouched. She is worth 10 soldiers. She is worth a year's salary. He barks orders. The language is a mix of Turkish and the rough lingua franca of the camps. The violence that follows is efficient. The older nuns, those too frail to survive the voyage or too old to fetch a price, are discarded. We will not dwell on the mechanics of their end, but know that it was swift and brutal, a clearing of damaged goods to make room for the prime stock. Sister Maria is grabbed by the arm. The grip is iron. It is the first time a man has touched her in 20 years. This is the first violation, the breaking of the seal. She is dragged from the chapel, her feet leaving the stone she knows, for the dirt she doesn't. She is moved into the courtyard. Here, the preparation begins. This is a stage of the trauma that is rarely discussed. We imagine the capture and then the prison. We forget the transition. The women are corralled. They are inspected. Veils are torn away not just out of cruelty, but out of assessment. They check teeth. They check eyes. They check skin. It is the same inspection given to horses in the Anatolian plains. The psychological impact of this moment is shattering. You are no longer a bride of Christ. You are lot number 405. The sensory details of this preparation are nightmare fuel. The smell of smoke is overwhelming, choking the lungs, making it hard to pray, hard to think. The sound is a cacophony of weeping and the shouting of bids. Yes, bids. The preliminary auctions often happened right there, amidst the burning ruins. Soldiers trading shares of their captives. The nuns are tied together. Ropes chafe wrists that have only known the weight of prayer beads. They are linked neck to neck, wrist to wrist. A chain of black cloth and pale skin. They are stripped of their crosses. The gold and silver are tossed into one pile, the wooden ones crushed underfoot. This is the targeted dehumanization. It is designed to break the will. A captive who has lost their identity is easier to transport. A captive who still believes they are a person is a flight risk. The Ottoman system knew that to make a slave, you must first unmake the human. For the nuns, this meant mocking their faith. Chronicles from the era, such as those by Bishop Graziani, speak of the captors forcing the women to carry the looted chalices and vestments, turning the procession of prisoners into a grotesque parody of a religious procession. They were forced to march through the rubble of their city, carrying the gold that would pay for their own imprisonment. Sister Maria walks. Her sandals are gone. The ground is hot ash. She looks at the sister in front of her. Sister Lucia, perhaps, a woman she sat beside in silence for a decade. Now, Lucia is weeping uncontrollably, her veil gone, her hair exposed, a shameful, naked feeling for them. Maria wants to comfort her, but to speak is to invite the whip. So she marshes. The machine demands movement. This wasn't improvised cruelty. It was infrastructure. As they reached the city gates, they encountered the scribes we mentioned earlier. The pensik or penkik, the 1/5 tax. By Islamic law of the time, 1/5 of the spoils belonged to the Sultan. This included the captives. The scribes were there to select the Sultan's share. Imagine the terror of this selection. To be chosen for the Sultan was, in a twisted sense, a higher status, but it meant being sent to the imperial harem or the households of the high elite in Istanbul. It meant there was zero chance of ransom. If you were owned by a common soldier, your family in Venice or Genoa might be able to buy you back eventually. If you became the property of the state, you were gone forever. The nuns stood shivering as the bureaucrats argued over them. They were poked and prodded. The best were separated. The machine was filtering them. Sister Maria is selected, not for her piety, but for her bearing. She is marked. A tag or a splash of paint on the hem of her garment or a note in the ledger. She has been processed. She is no longer a resident of Nicosia. She is now cargo destined for the capital of the world. This moment, standing at the gate, looking back at the burning convent, is the death of her past. The smoke rises like a dark prayer that no one is listening to. The realization settles in. God did not stop the walls from falling. God did not stop the hand that tore the veil. The theological crisis is as painful as the physical one. Where is the bridegroom? Why has he allowed his brides to be stripped? The silence of heaven is deafening. The march to the coast. The port of Kyrenia or Famagusta. The ships are waiting. Great Ottoman galleys, low in the water, smelling of tar, unwashed bodies, and the sea. To the nuns, these are not ships. They are floating coffins. The loading process is a spectacle. The local population who survived, the soldiers, the sailors, it is a crowd of thousands. The women are paraded onto the gangplanks. The public spectacle serves a purpose. It demonstrates the power of the empire. Look what we have taken. Look at the gods of the infidels, how powerless they are. The nuns are made to stand on the decks, exposed to the jeers of the crews. It is a theater of humiliation. But then comes the descent. The show is over. The hatch is opened. They are pushed down into the hold. If you have never been in the hold of a 16th century galley, you cannot imagine the horror. It is dark, damp, and crowded. The ceiling is low. You cannot stand upright. It smells of bilge water and rats. Sister Maria is pressed against the hull. The wood is damp. She can hear the water rushing on the other side inches away. This is the belly of the beast. Here, in the dark, the distinctions of rank disappear. The abbess is pressed against the novice, the noblewoman against the peasant. They are a mass of terrified humanity. The darkness is absolute. This wasn't chaos. It was storage. The efficient packing of cargo to maximize profit per square foot. The cruelty was secondary to the mathematics. They needed to fit 300 women in a space designed for 100. The air grows thin. Panic sets in. This is the private horror that the history books gloss over with the phrase, "They were taken to Istanbul." That phrase hides weeks of dysentery, starvation, and the psychological torture of total darkness. Days pass, or maybe weeks. Time dissolves in the dark. The only measure of time is the rhythmic beating of the drum for the rowers above, the sound of the whip cracking. The ship is a living organism of suffering. Above, men are chained to oars, rowing until their hearts burst. Below, women are chained to their fate, waiting to be sold. In this darkness, a transformation occurs. Sister Maria stops weeping. The shock wears off, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The machine thinks it has broken them. It thinks they are just inventory. But the machine forgets that these women spent their lives training their minds for silence, for suffering, for sacrifice. They are not ordinary captives. They are disciplined ascetics. Whispers begin in the dark. Not prayers for rescue, but prayers for strength. A new resolve forms. They realize that their bodies belong to the Sultan, but their wills are still their own. The intermediary, the captain of the ship, comes down to inspect the cargo. He brings a lantern. The light swings, casting long, dancing shadows. He checks for sickness. He brings water, just enough to keep them alive, not enough to quench the thirst. He looks at them with indifference. He does not see the change in their eyes. He sees livestock that is quieted down. He mistakes resignation for submission. This is the fatal flaw of the machine. It underestimates the human capacity for defiance when there is nothing left to lose. The nuns of the Order of Saint Clare and the noblewomen of Cyprus begin to communicate with glances, with squeezes of the hand. A plan is hatched. Not a plan for escape is impossible in the middle of the Aegean Sea. A plan for salvation. But not the kind of salvation the captain would understand. The human twist. History records the name of a woman sometimes called Arnalda de Rocas, sometimes simply a noblewoman of Nicosia who became the catalyst. Let us place Sister Maria beside her. The ship anchors. Perhaps near Chios or approaching the Dardanelles. The crew is celebrating. The vigilance is lax. The women are brought up to the deck for air and other maintenance protocol to ensure the cargo doesn't die of suffocation. The fresh air is dizzying. The stars are out. The lights of the fleet surround them. It is beautiful, which makes the horror worse. The twist happens in a heartbeat. It is a rejection of the script. The script says, you will be sold. You will be used. You will die in a harem. The woman Arnalda, Maria, the spirit of resistance, makes a choice. She spots the magazine, the powder store, or perhaps a torch left burning too close to the pitch-soaked timber. It proves humanity exists because it is an illogical choice for a biological organism. Biology says, survive at all costs. Humanity says, live free or die. The machine cannot calculate for martyrdom. Sister Maria moves. It is not a run. It is a glide. She grabs the torch. The captain turns. His eyes widen. He sees it. He doesn't see a woman anymore. He sees the error in his ledger. He sees the variable he forgot to account for. She doesn't scream. She doesn't cry. She simply drops the fire into the dark heart of the ship. This moment of silence before the roar is the most powerful moment in the story. It is the reclamation of power. You can take my city. You can take my convent. You can take my body. But you cannot take my consent. The explosion that rocked the fleet of Ali Pasha was recorded in history. The ship, the treasures, the best captives, all vaporized in a column of fire. It was a massive financial loss for the empire. But what of the others? The ships that didn't explode? The thousands of nuns and women who did not find the mercy of a quick death? We must follow them to the end of the line. To the capital, Istanbul, Constantinople, the city of the world's desire. As the ships pull into the Golden Horn, the visual splendor is undeniable. The domes of the Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, dominate the skyline. To the Ottoman victors, this is the center of civilization. To the captives in the hold, it is the mouth of hell. The deepening horror is the normalization of their status. They are unloaded. They are walked through the streets. not as prisoners of war, but as commodities. The slave markets of Istanbul, the Esir Pazarı, were institutions of terrifying banality. They were not dark alleys. They were regulated marketplaces with inspectors, taxes, and receipts. Sister Maria's surviving sisters are brought here. They are made to stand on raised platforms. The buyers circulate. Merchants, household stewards, eunuchs from the palace. They discuss the women's teeth, their hips, their likely longevity. The dehumanization is complete. The sacred vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are inverted. Poverty is replaced by being property. Chastity is sold to the highest bidder. Obedience is enforced by the whip. We must look at the macro here. This wasn't just sadism. It was economics. The empire ran on this influx of labor and bodies. The price of a slave fluctuated based on the success of the campaigns. After Nicosia, the market was flooded. Prices dropped. A Christian nun might be sold for the price of a good horse. Think about that. A human life, a lifetime of devotion, valued at the cost of a beast of burden. This is the cold, hard arithmetic of empire. For those sold into the domestic sphere, the fate worse than death began in earnest. Forced conversion was common, though Islamic law technically forbade forcing people of the book to convert. The social pressure and the reality of slave life often made it inevitable. To resist was to remain in the lowest strata of the household. To convert was to gain a sliver of status. Imagine the internal monologue of a nun in a harem. She is surrounded by luxury silks, sherbets, gardens. But it is a prison. She is forced to serve, forced to please. Every night is a battle for her soul. She whispers the Latin prayers under her breath, but the words start to fade from memory. The sensory details of the convent, the smell of incense, the rough wool are replaced by the smell of rosewater and the touch of silk. This is the suggestive horror. We do not need to describe the acts of violence explicitly. The violence is in the erasure. The nun, Sister Lucia, ceases to exist. She becomes Gulbahar or Nilüfer. She is renamed by her owner. Her past is wiped clean. She bears children who will be raised in the faith of the conquerors, who will perhaps grow up to be soldiers who conquer the next Christian city. It is a generational cycle of digestion. The empire eats the identity of the victim and uses the energy to grow. This is why it is worse than death. Death is an end. This is a transformation into the very thing you feared. It is the ultimate victory of the machine. It turns the victim into a component. However, we must also look at the resistance within the system. The human twist continues even here. Archives in Venice contain letters smuggled out by merchants or ransomed sailors from women who held on. Decades after their capture, some nuns maintained secret communities within the servant quarters of Istanbul. They couldn't wear the habit. They couldn't have a priest, but they kept the fasts. They baptized their children in secret with bathwater. They turned their servitude into a new form of martyrdom. This is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The machine can crush the body, it can rewrite the laws, it can change the names, but it struggles to extinguish the memory. These women became spies, intermediaries, sometimes even influencing their masters to leniency. They were the ghosts in the machine, but let us not romanticize it too much. For everyone who kept the faith, 10 were broken. 10 were used up and discarded. The Ottoman records show the mortality rates, the waste of the system. The graveyards of Istanbul are full of bones that were once baptized in Nicosia, nameless and unmarked. The silence of those graves is the loudest sound in history. Return to the ship that exploded. The one act of undeniable defiance. How did the system react? We have the records. The Ottoman reaction was not horror at the loss of life. It was annoyance at the loss of property. The admiral, Ali Pasha, was furious, not because women died, but because the ghanima, the spoil, was destroyed. They passed new regulations. Captives were to be searched more thoroughly. Gunpowder magazines were to be double-locked. The machine learned. It patched a hole in its security. It didn't question the morality of slavery. It just improved the logistics of transport. This is the chilling nature of bureaucratic evil. When a tragedy happens, the system doesn't ask, "Why are we doing this?" It asks, "How can we do this more safely next time?" The explosion became a statistic, a cautionary tale for galley captains. But in Europe, the reaction was different. The story of the Virgin of Cyprus who blew up the ship became a legend. It was preached from pulpits. It was written in pamphlets. It became propaganda. The Catholic Church used the story to rally troops for the Holy League, leading eventually to the Battle of Lepanto. So, in a way, that spark in the powder magazine did set the world on fire. It helped launch the fleet that would eventually check Ottoman naval dominance. Sister Maria's sacrifice wasn't in vain, but it was used. She was used by the Ottomans as a slave and used by the Europeans as a symbol. Even in death, she was an asset to a system. This is the micro colliding with the macro. A woman chooses death to escape being used, and her death is immediately used by everyone else. It is a cynical truth, but a necessary one to understand history. Let us consider the survivors' guilt of those who didn't blow up the ship. The ones who made it to Istanbul, the ones who were ransomed years later. We have accounts of nuns returning to Italy, broken, aged, strangers in their own land. They were treated with a mix of reverence and suspicion. Had they been defiled? Could they return to the convent? The church had to create theological workarounds to reintegrate these women. They were martyrs of the living. One specific account speaks of a nun who returned to Venice. She never spoke. She spent her days staring at the wall. The trauma was locked inside, a language no one else could speak. She had seen the face of the machine. She had seen how fragile civilization was. She knew that the walls of the convent were just stone, and stone can be broken. She knew that the vows were just words, and words can be silenced. She carried the deep dive truth. That safety is an illusion. The contrast here is sharp. The bustling, artistic, wealthy city of Venice, full of masquerades and music, and this silent woman in black, a walking void in the middle of the carnival. She's the ghost at the feast. She is the reminder that while Venice partied, Nicosia burned. The system eventually moved on. The Ottoman Empire began its slow decline. The borders shifted. The slave markets were eventually closed, not by moral awakening, but by the pressure of changing global economics and war. But the scars remained on the geography. In Cyprus, the convents were turned into barracks, then granaries, then ruins. The physical erasure was slow but steady. The reaction of history is often amnesia. We forget because it is painful to remember. We prefer the stories of knights and sultans, the glory of battle. We don't like the stories of the cargo hold. We don't like the stories of the ledger. Because if we look too closely at the ledger, we might see our own names. We might see that the difference between the civilized citizen and the barbaric slave is just a bad day, a fallen wall, and a change in management. The machine is always there, waiting for the walls to fall. Archaeology time jump. Cut to the present day. Nicosia is a divided city. A construction crew digging for a new foundation hits something hard. They stop. They brush away the dirt. It isn't gold. It's a mass grave. Or perhaps just a single small artifact. A bronze cross twisted by heat. A metal tag with a number. These physical objects are the only witnesses left. They don't lie. The chronicles can be biased. The Venetians exaggerated the numbers. The Ottomans minimized them, but the bone doesn't lie. The scratch marks on the wall of the excavated cellar don't lie. When we touch these objects, the centuries collapse. The 6,000 words of this script, the history books, the arguments, they all vanish. All that is left is the human reality. A woman stood here. She was terrified. She prayed, and she was taken. Modern forensics can tell us about their diet, their age, their health, but it cannot tell us their last thoughts. That is the domain of the storyteller. That is why we must tell this story, to fill the silence of the skull with the voice of the human. The philosophy. Why does this matter? Why should you, watching this on a screen 500 years later, care about the fate of Christian nuns under the Ottomans? Because it is not just about Ottomans and Christians. It is about power and the powerless. It is about what happens when human beings are reduced to objects. We live in a world of systems. We have our own bureaucracies, our own machines. We don't use galleys, but we have our own ways of processing people. The story of Sister Maria is a warning. It shows us that civilization is thin. It shows us that protocols and laws can be used to justify the most horrific crimes, as long as the paperwork is in order. The fate worse than death wasn't the pain. It was the indifference. The indifference of the scribe. The indifference of the captain. The indifference of the market. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an accountant. Sometimes it looks like a man just doing his job, following orders, clearing the inventory. Closing, we return to the image of the sea, the blue, beautiful Mediterranean. It has swallowed so many stories. Think of Sister Maria, not as a victim, but as a witness. Think of the woman who dropped the torch. She refused to be a line item. She refused to be a statistic. History is written by the victors, they say, but the truth is written in the scars. If this story unsettled you, if it made you look at the map differently, then it has done its job. We owe it to them to remember, to not let the machine have the final word. Uncomfortable truths matter. They are the only things that keep us human. Subscribe for more deep dives into the history they tried to bury. Hit the bell. And in the comments, tell me, what is the story from your country's history that everyone has forgotten? Let's dig it up together.